Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Planning Committee meeting. Just start things off, apologies for absence. I've had apologies from Councillor Margaret Wilkinson. Do you have any other apologies to note for the minutes? Okay, moving on to the minutes of the last meeting, distributed with the packs. Councillor Hodges, thank you. Seconder. Councillor Parker, thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is receive declarations of interest under the Council's Code of Conduct. I'll go around the circle, there's a few. So to my left first.
Yes, I'd like to declare an interest on agenda item number 9. It's a personal acquaintance to the person subject to enforcement action. I leave the room.
Thank you, Chair. I've got to declare on agenda item 10, and it's the last two, which is 1287 OUT and 328 full. 328 full, I am the applicant, and 1287 is my friend's property, or is adjacent to my friend's property. So I declare and leave the room on both.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to declare an interest 2017-00260 RG3 and 2016-01287 OUT. As a member of the Barry Town Council Planning Committee between 2012 and 2017, I was involved in discussions and providing comments on those sites. However, I'll be viewing both of those with a fresh pair of eyes tonight, having attended the site and received the report today, so I will not be leaving the room. Thank you much.
Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. Item 9, Upper Longcross Farm. The person affected by the enforcement notice is known to me. On agenda item 10, 2017/00260, I'm cabinet member for housing, so I'll be withdrawing for that item. And finally, on the 00 through 328. Councillor Bird is a personal friend, so I'll be withdrawing on that.
Thank you. Any further interest to declare? Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to agenda item number 4. This is a report on the site inspections that took place before the last meeting. For noting. Yeah, Councillor Johnson, thank you. Moved. And seconder, Councillor Drake. Thank you. Next we have the building regulation applications and other building control matters determined by head of regeneration and planning under delegated powers for noting. Thank you. And item 6, planning applications determined by head of regeneration and planning under delegated powers for noting. Thank you. And now we move on to note the appeals. And I know Marcus wanted to say a few words on the appeals.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just for members, obviously in this bundle is the reference to the United Reformed Church application, which obviously was of some interest to committee. The key issue, or the key paragraphs really are the last two paragraphs where the views of the inspector are summed up, and essentially the inspector says, with all the above issues in mind, on balance the development was considered to be efficient and sustainable use of a building that would contribute to housing land supply, including affordable housing. And he also goes on to say the impact of the conditions, parking conditions would be minor, bearing in mind the fallback position, and would not amount to any serious harm to highway safety. So obviously the inspector has not agreed with us and has decided to allow that appeal. So that is there for members. And then with reference to a decision committee took last committee meeting with respect to a fence in the front garden, there is a decision here in Cowbridge, 16 Cyrex, Llanblethian, which was very, very similar in where somebody's erected a fence above a low stone wall, or low brick wall in front of the property, and the inspector has agreed with the recommendation that an enforcement notice be served, and has upheld that, so that supported the council in that view.
Thank you. I've just realised I didn't read out the thing I was supposed to at the commencement of the meeting, so if you bear with me for 2 seconds. May I remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live via the internet, and the recording of which archived for future viewing for those to note. Councillor Hodges, on the appeals issue.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't think committee will be surprised that I will be speaking a little on this one. Obviously, it's the United Reformed Church one. Just for everyone's notice, I previously declared at each and every opportunity on this when living across the site from I do, but now it's actually finished with the decision by the inspector. I think I should just say a few words. I think this is a shame that they've come to this conclusion. I think it's a dangerous precedent for the future of our council. I don't see it as an affordable development. You wait till you see they're built and the prices they are. And also I believe that this will cause a severe parking and driving situation in the area. And I think it's a dangerous precedent for this council when it comes to any future look at a residential building adaptation in an urban area, and it causes me great concern. So I just thought I'd put that on record. This council was right, I believe, to go against this application. But now it's there, I think it's mindful of the council to do everything to make it work, which includes the promise of double yellow lines along the side of the church, and I look forward to the promised school crossing there as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hodges. Anyone else wish to comment on the appeals before I move that? Okay, can I have someone to move that, please, and we'll move forwards. Note. Thank you. Next item on the agenda for notes is the trees delegated list. Thank you very much. Move on to item 9, enforcement action. Number 1 under enforcement action is Upper Landcross Farm, Leckwith in Cardiff. I'm going to just ask the members who are withdrawing, please leave the chamber. Now people have left who have an interest. Marcus, perhaps you can talk us through this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is an application. Well, sorry, this is an enforcement notice we are proposing in respect of an existing caravan at Upper Landcross Farm. This site has quite a long and checkered planning history, but essentially the facts are that there was an application for a mobile temporary home following numerous applications for agricultural buildings at the site. That application was originally refused by the council but allowed on appeal by a planning inspector back in 2010. Oh, sorry, allowed in 2011, sorry, but the appeal was in 2010. The temporary mobile home was allowed on the basis of the applicant trying to establish an agricultural business and therefore needing to be on site. There have been a number of small additions to the caravan. You'll notice in applications 2012 for a log burning stove and then for a extra bedroom to the caravan. The temporary consent expired in 2014. The owner has been contacted, and we've been in quite protracted discussions with the owner about what they do following that. They essentially haven't been able to justify that the business is a business which would support a dwelling in that location. And eventually they applied for permission in 2016. The application is in the planning history, and you'll notice that was refused because it was felt that it was not a business which justified a dwelling in that location. And following this and following a bit more protracted discussions, we now have we are now seeking enforcement action because obviously our concerns are that following 2014 the caravan became unauthorised, And obviously, if it is on the site for any length of time, it is 10 years. But if it's on the site for any length of time, you can establish something by lawful use. So we are now seeking enforcement action to remove the caravan, which is not justified in its location.
Thank you, Marcus. Anyone wish to comment? Oh. Councillor Bennett.
I just wanted to clarify, actually. I know this area of land. I don't know the applicants or anything else quite well. For many years, my parents-in-law lived just up the road from it. So we've got a fairly protracted planning thing there, but there has been a small holding on this area for many years. I'm going back 30 years probably. And I know that there were issues then, because it certainly wasn't pigs at that point. I think it was sheep and stuff like that, that they were trying to get some sort of agricultural use. I mean, it's a shame when none of the neighbours have complained. You know, there are no objections from neighbours, and it's something that, I mean, my belief is from reading the documents that it's built up to be about, is it about 20 hectares or something now, which is quite sizable, isn't it, for a small holding? Oh, sorry.
It is a relatively, it's not the greatest land, I have to say, quality of land, and right through the history of this site, it's always been a struggle for the applicant to justify the amount of income needed to justify income and time needed to justify the applicant. I understand still works partially in agriculture and partially in another business unrelated to agriculture or rural businesses, and unfortunately the guidelines are very clear. To justify a dwelling in a location like this, you do have to have gone through all the various the guidance that's set out in the technical advice note, which is very clear. So I don't. While we have had some sympathy, and you'll note from the protracted nature of the discussions, we've tried to show the applicant some leniency in terms of trying to get to this point. I think we've now reached the point where we don't think it's ever going to really be justified, and so we have recommended the enforcement notice.
Councillor Thomas.
Yeah, can I just ask for information? Looking at the photograph on the plans here, there are a number of other buildings all within that vicinity, including what looks like some sort of yard behind the building in question. Can you sort of give us some idea of what all these things are? And I mean, it looks quite sort of already established as some sort of built area.
There's been a small agricultural operation here for some years, and what you can see there is a ramshackle yard and buildings associated with that business. Unfortunately, as I've said, the fact is we have to look at the accounts, we have to look at the business operation to justify a dwelling in this location, and we've just not got to that point. They've been given a temporary consent for a caravan to try and establish the business. That's quite standard practice in terms of agricultural and rural businesses. You don't automatically grant a dwelling. You normally will give a business time to try and bed in and justify its location, but that hasn't happened in this case, unfortunately. And while they do have some buildings there and a yard area, they still haven't been able to show sufficient throughput of cattle and I think it's a pig farm mainly to actually justify the business.
So the buildings are things he's established.
Some of them were there, and I think they've been there for some time. Some he obtained planning permission for after they were erected, but yes, they've been established over a long period of time.
Councillor Penrose.
Officer recommendation, please, Chair.
Thank you. Seconder? Councillor Hodges. All in favour, please. And against? And abstentions? 2. Thank you very much. We could get the members back in who don't have a interest in the next item. Now move forward to planning applications, agenda item 10. First application for consideration is 2017-00260/RG3, land to the east of Holmview Leisure Centre, Skomer Road, Barry. Victoria, would you like to speak on this, please?
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, if I can just draw members' attention, please, to the late representations. In particular, the ones that have been circulated yesterday provide updates to members in respect of the fact that we've now adopted the local development plan on the 28th of June. Therefore, all the papers in the Planning Committee report that were circulated before that date refer to the unitary development plan policies. Those are now to be disregarded as they are no longer the development plan policies, and you need to refer to the local development plan policies which have been cited in the late representations. So that's for noting on all the reports. Can I also draw your attention to an email that's been tabled? Hopefully that's made its way around the table to everybody, just to confirm that Margaret Wilkinson, who I believe is the local member here, has tendered her support for the development of the land to the east of Holmview Barry as long as all the conditions are met, and she recognises there's a great need for specially adapted housing for assisted living in the area. Thank you, members. A site visit was undertaken to the site this morning, so thank you to those members that were able to make it to that. At that meeting, there was some discussion about the ability to access the land to the rear of the site, which is the rugby pitch playing fields. And I'll send round a plan for you to have a look at around the table. I'm sorry there's only 2 copies, but what this plan demonstrates is the public right-of-way network in the vicinity of the site, and some of the members were interested in that, so you can have a look at that and we can discuss it if anyone's got any questions about that. Okay, so I'll start with the description of the development. The application is made by the council for council housing proposal, so 11 affordable housing units on the site. 7 terrace units at the front of the site, and then 4 bungalow properties towards the rear of the site. As we saw today on the site visit, the site slopes up from Skomer Road. It's adjacent to the Holmview Leisure Centre, where the existing access to the leisure centre is proposed to be used to serve this development, and also to go on and serve the remaining part of the allocation, as this forms half of an LDP allocated site. So you can see from the plan on the screen at the moment that the access road here will go up and wrap round to the land at the back as well. As such, then there is a proposal for a new entrance access for vehicles to serve Holmview Leisure Centre, which again is shown on the plan on the screen behind me, just to the south of the existing access. Highways are satisfied that both of those accesses are acceptable in highway terms. It does result in a minimal loss of parking for the leisure centre, but there's still ample there to meet the needs of the leisure centre and the units nearby. In terms of the parking provision for the houses themselves, the units fronting onto Skomer Road have a parking court behind them, and then the remaining bungalow properties at the rear have a more traditional parking layout adjacent to each of the relevant houses. They all comply with the council's parking standards in terms of the type of accommodation proposed and the location. We have had objections from neighbouring properties, from one objector whose issues are cited in the report, dealing with loss of a view and the general impact of having a new housing estate on what was formerly open space fields, and another letter raising some issues of concern in terms of drainage, and obviously those matters are dealt with in the report. The officer's recommendation is for approval. I would note that in cases such as this for affordable housing that's being promoted by the council, we don't seek Section 106 planning obligations, and that issue is dealt with on page 60 of the report. And I think that pretty much covers it, unless anyone's got questions.
Thank you very much. Does anyone wish to comment on the application? Councillor Johnson, hand up first.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's very positive that the council. Firstly, I think this is a good scheme. I think it's very positive that the council are going forward with building council houses ourselves rather than through RSLs. So I do think that's a positive, and that comes out of for newer councils. That comes out of a result of the housing revenue account subsidy scheme being scrapped because there were £5 million that was going from this council every year, some of which is now being reinvested within our housing plan. I do have just a query which is regarding the right of way, because although there's not an official right of way, it was made clear by one of the local members on the site visit this morning that there is a pleasure path that runs through this site onto reservoir fields, and there's a separately there is a from the map that's been circulated to us tonight, there is a right of way that runs elsewhere out of one of the previous previously developed sections around there. I'm just wondering, sort of in terms of how if there's any way of resolving an issue where people have an existing pleasure path, as it were, up that slope through the reservoir fields, on which there is a right of way onto Merthyr Dyfan Road and up to Port Road, or whether that is something that simply is far beyond the scale of anything that this committee might be considering.
Victoria?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So what I would say is for this development, as we've talked about, this is in 2 phases. So this parcel that's being developed, obviously you can see from the layout plan that there is a road that'll loop round to the existing field. So for now, that informal access will essentially still be operative, because the land adjacent will remain open, and that we saw today on site there was still plenty of opportunities to cross into the rugby field to the north, which incidentally is also council land, the Parks Department's land. So I would say for this application, it's not something that we need to be alarmed or concerned about, because that informal arrangement will essentially be maintained through this one. It may well be an issue that we need to consider further in terms of any detailed layout for the phase 2 element, which would essentially develop the rest of that parcel, and we'll need to consider whether or not it is necessary to ensure that another access is maintained onto those fields from that development. There are opportunities at other parts along those fields to break out from the adjoining housing, so it wouldn't be that this was the only opportunity to cut through for the wider public, but it is certainly something that we can have a look at next time.
Yeah, Councillor Johnson.
If we just also come back, just regarding to page 60, which was about the financial obligations on 100% affordable housing. I just wanted to, it's just for clarification, because this is a site that has a capacity of 50 according to the recently passed local development plan, but it's only 11 on the site here. I'm just wondering, sort of, if there is, again, it's not necessarily just to do with this site, but whether the cumulative impact of multiple developments would be considered when we're talking about Section 106 in future. And I said not necessarily for, something for this site, but I'm just trying to get my head around how that operates, because it's referred to on page 60. But you may have a situation where someone comes in and builds 15 and then builds another 50. I just want some clarification on that.
Thank you. Yes, you're quite right. When the next application comes in for the remaining part of the development, we will need to take into account these 11 units and what the cumulative impact is and what the necessary Section 106 requirements are as a result of that. So that'll be an issue for round 2.
Yes, having had those clarifications, could I move the officer's recommendation, please?
Thank you. I've got 2 more who've already declared they want to speak, but I'll take that and we'll come back to that in 2 seconds. Councillor Hodges, you still wish to speak?
Yeah, just briefly, Chairman, I welcome this. It's needed. I'm glad that our council is at last doing these schemes, and I'll second it.
Thank you. Councillor Thomas.
I was going to second as well. I think the idea that the the council now is building council houses for social use is admirable. I think that this is a move that should have been made many years ago, and we should never have had the rights to do this taken away from us by a previous Westminster government. But I will support this 100%. It is a brilliant step forward.
Thank you. We'll move to a vote then on the application. Those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you very much. Before we move on to the next application, anyone with an interest, can we change around, please? Moving on to item 2016, the next application, 2016-01287/OUT, land to the rear of Baobab Highlight Lane. This site fronts Buckingham Place. Victoria, you can talk on this, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Again, thanks to those members that were able to make the site visit this morning. I think we had a really good look at the site and viewed the property from a couple of neighbouring gardens as well as from the street at Highlight Lane and on Buckingham Place. So we've had a good look at this morning. Again, I draw your attention to the late reps in terms of the updated policy references to the local development plan rather than mutual development plan policies. Okay, in terms of the proposals, this is an outline application that has been amended during the course of its consideration. Initially, it was proposed to have 5 houses on this plot. That's been amended down through negotiation to 3 now dormer bungalow properties, which are shown on the layout plan. As the application is in outline, the matters that are before us for consideration at the moment are access, layout and scale. Whereas landscape and appearance are still reserved matters. So what that means is we don't know precisely what the elevations of these dwellings will look like, nor how many bedrooms and what the windows will be serving. Those matters would be covered in the appearance, and similarly landscaping is self-explanatory. But nevertheless, you can see from the layout plan where these properties are going to be accessed, where the properties are going to be located, and what the scale parameters are of the dwellings. So I doubt whether you can make it out from the screen because I can't, but I think we looked at on site that the height of the dwellings was, I think, 6.9. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty confident that's what it was. They're dormer bungalow type properties, as we've alluded to. The parking provision on each of the plots satisfies the council's parking guidelines. At this stage, we don't know exactly how many bedrooms, so we're not able to do the one-for-one sort of assessment of that. But nevertheless, plots 1 and 2, quite clearly from the site plan, you can see would be around 4 parking spaces. Plot 3 between 2 and 3 spaces, depending on where you locate those. But obviously, landscaping details can also amend the landscaping layout there, but the access is via those 3 points on Buckingham Place. As we saw on site today, it will involve moving a telegraph pole and a lamppost. That's dealt with in the conditions. There have been a number of objections to this application, and those are dealt with at page 72 of the report. So we've received 40 letters of objection raising a number of issues. In addition, we've had another, I think it was 39 or 40 identical letters of objection, like a petition letter, if you like, submitted. The issues raised relate, listed there at page 72, but concerns about traffic and parking, disturbance during the construction, the impact of having these properties and any impact on neighbouring properties, and the existence of 2 large trees which are on the boundary of the application site and the neighbouring properties, which again we saw on site today. The officer's recommendation is for approval, subject to conditions. That's it for now, thanks.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Councillor Rowlands.
I have a few concerns in regards to this application, mostly in regards to the parking. It states in the report plots 1 and 2 can accommodate up to 4 vehicles, and then plot 3, 2, 3, that's roughly around about 10. Now, Highlight Park has a parking issue. Even our own refuge collection lorries find it difficult to do their duties. So that, you know, I do find that parking would be an issue on that, rather than according to the report it says it won't. Even with our when we had a site visit today, we had 5 councillors' cars, and it was, you know, the road is quite narrow there. So I would say parking is an issue with this one in particular. I just wanted to clarify something in regards to on page 78, it said there would be some additional traffic over the existing levels through the course of the construction, but there's sort of be temporary period. Do we know of like a time frame when this would be built, or can we put something in where it, you know, we can have a time limit on it, because it would obstruct obviously the residents in that area.
Thank you, Councillor Rowlands. Victoria?
Thank you. Okay, in respect of parking, as I alluded to and as it's stated in the report, plots 1 and 2 accommodating up to 4 vehicles, that is generous for houses of this size, and would more than adequately meet the requirements for those dwellings, and obviously they're provided off-street. In addition, plot 3, the report says between 2 and 3 spaces. Again, we don't know how many bedrooms are going to be included in that plot, but arguably 2 to 3 spaces again is quite generous for most dwellings. Yes, this will create drop curbs along that part of Buckingham Place where currently there may be some availability of on-street parking, but that wouldn't be a reason to refuse this application. You know, it certainly would be quite dangerous grounds of appeal when such a lot of parking is being provided to meet the houses that have been proposed. I really would be concerned about raising a reason for refusal around parking. As I've said in the report, there's no objection to the application from our highway engineers, and our own parking standards, as members will no doubt start to become very familiar with. Planning Policy Wales and our own parking standards talk about maximum parking standards rather than minimum, and we're supposed to be moving away from developments that are, you know, so wholly reliant on the car, and parking is seen, car parking and parking provision is seen as one of those influences as to whether or not people use their cars and so on. So hopefully I've offered you reassurance about the parking levels, but I certainly would, you know, make members aware that I would be concerned about refusing the application on the grounds of parking. I don't think that's justified in this case. In terms of the construction traffic, we haven't recommended a construction traffic management plan condition, nor would I suggest that one is necessary on an application of this sort of scale. You know, yes, it's a cul-de-sac where there are existing residential properties close by, but we're only talking about the construction of 3 dwellings here. It's not a major development. There will be construction traffic associated with it, and that will need to be managed. And if there are any problems in terms of obstructing the highway, then obviously there are the Highway Authority and the police have powers to do something about that. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we need a construction traffic management plan here. Most contractors these days, you know, sign up to the Considerate Constructors programme, and you know, would obviously try to work with the neighbours in the street to make sure that disruption is minimised.
Thank you, Victoria. Councillor King.
Thank you, Chair. I have some sympathy with Councillor Rowland's comment, because whilst planning guidance and all the rest of it, and our own thrust is to try and persuade people not to use cars, I think it's unrealistic to expect people not to have cars, and therefore,
what we want is to persuade them to leave their car at home. We're talking about a residential area. So yes, I understand that there is adequate provision for the cars that are likely to come with the dwellings, but by the drop curbs and access, they will then remove what is presumably current on-road parking. So I don't think it's quite as simple as we're being told. I'm not suggesting it's grounds to object, but I'm saying the whole issue about parking is more complicated than looking at this one development. It's the cars in that road, aka the subject we talked about earlier.
Thank you, Marcus.
All I would say actually is that Councillor Rowlands did mention quite rightly about the difficulties for bin lorries and vehicles to get up and down the street, and actually what this will do, if cars are parking against the fence which is currently there and hedge, they won't be able to park there as freely, so actually will free up movement for vehicles like bin lorries to actually get down there, so I would point that out as well.
Councillor Thomas, and I'll come to you.
Yeah, again, it's on parking. I think Councillor Runn's right in highlighting it, in that area seems to be, I mean, it's on the boundary of Barry's sort of settlement. It's way out, almost. I mean, the next stop is countryside. People, it's not really within walking distance of anything. Even Tesco's is a reasonable hike away. So people down there will be using cars to a high degree, but the parking that is provided off-road does seem adequate for these properties. Other properties down there all seem to have off-road parking by observation this morning. As you rightly point out, movement up and down at the moment, anything parked along that hedge, along that side, would be restricted. Would restrict that piece of road. Although when we were all parked down there was room for other stuff to get past. I noticed this morning. So despite the extra 5 cars that were down there, it did not seem to sort of create that much of a problem with the road. I moved the officer's recommendations with the conditions particularly.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. I've got a couple of more people who wish to speak. Councillor Rowlands.
Just one point I was going to say. Some of one of the recommendations is to the appearance of landscape and development is for reserved matters. Could I request that be brought to the committee, if possible?
By all means, those matters can come to committee. What I would ask the member to do is at that time call the matter to planning committee, as obviously time goes by and I couldn't guarantee absolutely that we would remember that you had made this request, which may well be 2 years from now. So I'm sure you will remember, no doubt, and you will be consulted on the matter as normal through the normal consultation process. So I'd be grateful if you could call it in at that time if you feel it's necessary.
We'll certainly make sure that is noted as part of this meeting's deliberations. Councillor Parker.
Yeah, that was going to be my thing. I would move officer's recommendation and ask that we all make sure that delegation is removed and it comes back to committee for careful consideration of all the conditions. I mean, I'm very confident we're adequately safeguarded, particularly with regard to the trees, the car parking, the crossovers. The crossovers are quite wide, and I think there could be an improvement on keeping the crossovers down to a minimum width as opposed to how they appear at the moment to double width. So on that basis, I'd move officer's recommendation.
Councillor Penrose. Okay, well, I think Councillor Parker was seconding, Councillor Thomas is moving, but if we move to a vote on that issue, please. All those in favour of the application? Any against? Any abstentions? Okay, that application passes. Thank you very much. Moving on to the next item, I know some members are leaving, maybe some members are coming back. I'll just pause for a moment. Okay, moving on now to final planning application. This saves the agenda. 2017-00328/FUL. Dufferin Springs, St Latham's Roads, Dufferin. Marcus.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, this is an application for a permanent wedding building or venue to be constructed in place or in lieu of a tent or marquee type construction that has been on the site for some time since it was originally approved. Members may be aware this site, known as Dufferin Springs, originally started out as a farm diversification project with a fishery, a small fishing pond and fishermen's log cabin next to it. As time has gone on, the business has grown, and the venue started to be used for weddings. In due course, an application was made for a temporary marquee on the site in 2009. That application was allowed. There have been subsequent applications, but since the expiration of that consent for the marquee, the applicant has decided that now the time is right to make the application permanent for a permanent building. The wedding venue has been successful in terms of attracting the public and in terms of a business. And indeed, the report runs through the history of the site and the assessment of the proposal against current policy and obviously against the new policies from the LDP as well, which are now the relevant policies. It is a tourism and rural business venture which has been successful, and having considered the fact we've given a temporary consent in the past, that temporary consent has now lapsed, but the business itself was successful. And if you like, you can turn this on its head and look at the original, the enforcement notice we were talking about for the farm business, which wasn't successful. Going about it this way and giving a temporary consent does allow the council to take a view on a venture and make sure we don't get a permanent building, which perhaps if we'd have done this, let's say 4 years ago, and it hadn't been successful, you're left with a building in the countryside. Clearly now what we have is a successful business which will expand now into this business, into this building. The building itself has been designed to look very much like a traditional barn. It is within a special landscape area, and the report does deal with all of that, but it is considered that it successfully blends into its surroundings and will have no impact on the special landscape area, no negative impact on the special landscape area. On a final point, you will note when we go back to that there is a long track which accesses which is used to access the site. That was granted planning permission some years ago, and there are 70 car parking spaces around the building, which are used in connection with the fishing as well. Have a joint use, but obviously will be used when a wedding function is held at the venue. So your officers are recommending approval, subject to the conditions you find at the end of the report.
Thank you, Councillor Hodges.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a pedantic question, really. It's simply because in the description at the start on 96, it's got construction of a building to serve as a wedding venue. And I'm just wondering, is it totally restricted to that, or could other events be booked there? That's my question.
Thank you. Marcus?
Yeah, it has been in the past restricted to that when it was a marquee, and we've decided to continue that by ensuring that it is restricted to that within Class D2, which is the class within which such a venue would fall. So we have decided to do that. That is what the application was made for on that basis. If in the future the applicant decided they wanted to do, I don't know, it could be alternative. We could look at those, and we would have to assess it. But essentially, that's what it's been restricted to now, just to give clearly that little bit of control to the council to make sure something doesn't happen untoward.
I must admit, I missed that suggestion, Councillor Hodges. Your microphone wasn't on. Councillor Johnson.
So just similar sort of question. I just wanted a bit of clarification. The officer just referred to a business being successful or not successful. And I'm just wondering to what extent that is a judgment that can be made by an officer of this council when it comes to a private business. And also just clarifying the role of on page 102, we're told that the council's tourism marketing section were consulted but have not made any comments. I'm just clarifying what their role is. So in addition to that question about the officers being able to decide whether something is or is not a successful business, and therefore that's how that fits into our planning operations here. Also, just clarification on the role of the council's tourism and marketing in regards to that, to them being consulted, and what weight or not we should give to anything they may or may not say on this or any item similar in future.
Thank you. Marcus.
That's a very good point, and I think it's useful to explain how we do assess these. Clearly, when we have an application, let's take it back to the agricultural application. When we have an application for an agricultural business or a dwelling associated with an agricultural business, we have to assess the success or the likely success of that business to make sure that we're not approving a building or a dwelling which is going to be there in 10, 15 years' time, but the business isn't, and we're going to have an issue to deal with of somebody trying to turn it into just an ordinary dwelling or use the building for something else. So the same applies when we're looking at agricultural diversification. So we like to be confident that the use that's being proposed as part of that diversification isn't going to lead to a building being built, which in a few years' time is all of a sudden vacant and somebody wants to put some kind of other business there or convert it to dwellings or do something else. So we do make a judgment. We do look at the business plan. When, in this particular case, when the applicant first made the application for the marquee and the wedding business to be run here, that was looked at in some detail to make an assessment as to how successful that business was likely to be. We do have certain expertise in the regeneration and planning team to look at it, not necessarily planning officers, but we have our operational manager for regeneration who we do use occasionally to assess business plans. He will look at those. He has the background in terms of looking at that from the future. We also have two economic development officers, one who's formerly worked for Finance Wales, who has the expertise, if you like, to assess the business plan and say whether it is a plan that's likely to succeed. So we will look at that to give us a feeling for the likely success of this business going forward. Now that was done to a large extent when the temporary consent was granted. It's run now for that period of time, for a number of years, the view generally from a planning background is that if it's succeeded for that length of time, there comes a point where you have to accept that this business will continue. And we do that with agricultural businesses, and we often do that with rural businesses in general. You heard me talking about Technical Advice Note 6, which is the rural business technical advice note, covers farming, covers all sorts of other areas, and it's the approach that's recommended by that technical advice note. We're quite lucky in this council that we do have that expertise, if you like, in the same department to be able to make that judgment and to assess what the success of the business will be going forward. So it is a material consideration, because we do have to look at this building and think, obviously this is quite a big building. Now you could look at that and say, should the business fail in 12 months' time, it would make quite a nice dwelling in the countryside. So this is why we are looking at it to make sure it doesn't suddenly, we're not faced with another application in a few years' time for something like that. Does that help? The Council of Marketing and Tourism team would look at it. Well, when we originally had the application for the temporary use, obviously their expertise is in what sorts of tourism-related businesses and funnily enough, weddings do fall within that sort of category. Whether they are going to succeed, their involvement started with the fishing lake, and they were involved in sort of helping to promote that in due course. But we also wanted to get feedback from them as to how successful it actually was as well. Clearly, we run a website based around tourism, which does pick up on these things. Now, they haven't actually responded to this one, but I have to say we probably were of the view that given we've got such a history of success there, we didn't necessarily need a response. But their response in previous ones would have been invaluable in terms of assessing, was the marquee essential? Did it, if you like, did it help the business develop? As a tourism feature as well, we know that they have advertised, or they have been part of one of the things we've publicised on the tourism website of the council at this particular venue. So things like that are what we would take into account when we look at this planning application going forward.
Councillor Johnson.
So as long as we're not promoting this venue more than any other applicable venues in the area, I'm aware that that some members of this committee have left the room because they're friends with Councillor Bird. I'm not a friend or an enemy, but I'd like to move this then.
Thank you. Do I have a second? Thank you. All those in favour of the application? I believe that's unanimous. Thank you very much. We'll move on to agenda item 11. I don't know if our two members who've left are coming back in for agenda item 11. I think they have left. We'll do a quick double check. Under agenda item 11, I did give permission to table item that I consider was urgent for the committee to consider. It's a housekeeping note really around the adoption that's taken place of the LDP. I'll just ask Victoria to speak to this.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, apologies that this has come as a late item to you, but it is quite urgent for us as we have a number of matters that are currently on the books that need action, and we didn't want to delay it for another 3 weeks. Following the adoption of the local development plan, as I've alluded to in the late reps, all the unitary development plans policies become null and void. So we can't refer to them in any future decision notices or enforcement notices that the council serve. And a number of matters have come to planning committee over the previous months, possibly years, where those formal decision notices have not yet been issued, and all of those notices refer to the old unitary development plan policies. So to a large extent we are talking about enforcement notices, such as the one that you've granted this evening, authorisation to serve an enforcement notice. There are a number of outstanding matters that we have not served the enforcement notice yet, but the committee granted the authorisation for that several months ago. Similarly, we've got Section 106 agreements on planning applications, so where planning applications were granted by planning committee subject to a Section 106 legal agreement, that can take several months to resolve before the decision notice is issued. So the purpose of this report is to get your authorisation for us, for myself and Marcus, to amend those reasons for either serving the enforcement notice or for granting planning permission in the case of the Section 106 applications, and all the conditions and the reasons for conditions. So it is just a matter of housekeeping. As members will be aware of the report that was before full council, and a member briefing before that session where we talked about the differences between the UDP and the LDP. For the vast majority of the development management type policies that this planning committee considers when looking at planning applications and enforcement matters, the vast majority of them have quite neatly transposed from UDP policies into LDP policies, or certainly the thrust of what they're seeking to achieve has. So it will simply be a case of replacing the relevant policy numbers. What the report also does is say, actually, if there has been a significant material change in planning policy as a result of the shift from UDP to LDP, those matters will come back to you for further consideration. I haven't been through all of the matters that we're talking about. I think there are about 20 to 30 of them. So I'll need to do that as and when we're going through each individual one. I don't envisage that there will be any that need to come back to you because there's been a material shift in planning policy. But obviously if there are, we will bring them back, and this report deals with that in the second recommendation before you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Johnson.
Yes, the officers actually just answered the question I was going to raise, which is about recommendation 2 and whether it was likely that anything would be coming back to us because it's of a material change. But if it's nothing that has been envisaged, then I would assume that there's going to be a simple move from one set of policies to the other, unless there's been a change here, which I'm not being made aware of. And on that note, just move the recommendations.
Second.
Thank you very much. All those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and look forward to seeing you again on the 27th of July, I believe. Thank you.